general overview of what the main arguments are, kind of where I see myself intervening in current research on religion and culture. And for those sociologists in the room, you'll know what I mean when I've kind of really taken a symbolic interactionist approach. So it is an ethnography-driven research, so there is a lot of attention to the interactions that take place between people. More so, there's definitely interview quotes, and interviews are part of the study. But I think that what really drives the book is the conversations that unfold between church members in what were called small group settings. So all that said, my main claim is that seemingly trivial talk at church is just as powerful as the loudest voices of the religious and political right. So there's been a lot of research about Christian nationalism. Anybody ever heard that term? Especially if you're going to the NANO conference, I'm sure you might be talking about it, especially lately. And, you know, that tends to focus on organizations and churches that take a vocal, hardline stance on what are typically called culture war issues. So really popular books of late of Tim Alberta's The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers, Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead, who are both sociologists, their book Taking Back America for God, where that they're really unpacking the characteristics of Christian nationalism, like what constitutes Christian nationalism, where do people in the general public stand on the idea that there should be a marriage between church and state, and a particular version of Christianity, right? So this is a particular conservative, fundamentalist idea of Christianity that's often part of this Christian nationalist movement and discourse. We've certainly seen it unfold in the news in the past week, so I won't get into that, but you know, there's a lot of coverage about Christian nationalism and religious nationalism. So I went into this study in 2016. I talk about in the preface of the book that I kind of stumbled upon this church that I use a pseudonym for. I call it Welcome Church. And I was somewhat new to Oxford. I moved there in 2014 from Pittsburgh. I'm originally from Mississippi. I haven't been in Mississippi for something like 20-something years in terms of living there. So I felt estranged in what was my homeland, where I got my accent, and I just played with the kitty cats in the creek, you know, that kind of thing. I was kind of warming back up to the place. And I was teaching classes on like religion, gender, and sexuality. Of course, I regularly teach, you know, religion, gender, sexuality. Kind of want to know what kind of support services are in the area for family planning, reproductive care. And a friend of mine who teaches in the history department, she was teaching women's history. So we were both like, hey, let's go find out what this place that's called the Pregnancy Center, what they do. We both had a hunch what the Pregnancy Center does. It's part of the larger umbrella of crisis pregnancy centers. But we just wanted to go there and ask them in person, like, what do you offer? How do you describe yourself? And we weren't doing it as a study. We were literally just like, okay, we're part of this community. Let's go find out what they say for themselves rather than what we read they might say. And it was there that I met a volunteer named that I call Diane. And Diane starts telling me about this new church called Welcome and how different the church is than anything else going on in town. And I'm a sociologist of religion, so I like perked up my ears. My dissertation was on Christian and Muslim punk. So this idea that you use music, subcultural music, to reach people and tell them about your religious convictions, or in the case of Muslim punk, to actually fight against Islamophobia. Using punk as a part of protest. Shout out to my friends back here studying punk. But with that said, the way that she was talking about this church reminded me a lot of this evangelical, subcultural, hardcore punk, metalcore kids that I had been studying. There was a lot of emphasis on they welcome everybody, they want to meet people where they are. It was very much this language of they're doing something different. And what she kept emphasizing, and I don't know why she kept looking at me. At the time I had like this kind of asymmetrical haircut with like some blue here. So I don't know if that's what the thing was, but she was looking at me like, you know, you should just really check it out. And I was like, okay, maybe I should. But they weren't meeting in a regular church building. And while this is not unique for plant churches, we're called church plants. Anybody familiar with that term? Yeah, what do you think of when you hear church plant? Sorry, you're eating. You're mid-chew. But I'm curious, like, what do you think when you hear that?
I think of mega churches or larger scale churches that have had a split in the congregation and have decided to plant a second one somewhere else.
Okay, yeah, and then there could be multi-campus ministry. So like, his name's escaping me. He was an ex-president of the Southern Baptist Convention, but he has...
Al Mohler.
No, but in Durham, North Carolina. So campus ministry, kind of that you multiply the church rather than build larger churches. You're right on point. And the idea is multiplicity. So this church had been planted by a longer standing Southern Baptist church in the town. And it was meeting in a public facility. In the book, I call it a recreation center. I'll just leave it at that. But this is somewhat ordinary in a lot of places now, that there has been more Supreme Court rulings that have helped churches start meeting in public facilities when schools are not in session. So this is one of those cases. So recreation center, that's part of the larger community, but it's closed on Sunday mornings, then the church can rent it out, and then they can meet in that facility. So that's what Diane was really remarking on, is that they were doing something different, because most churches go to like a regular place and they do the like hymnal thing. They get up and stand, they sit down and they stand up, and it's not very exciting. For her, this was exciting. I think I'm just mentioning that the context of Oxford, being that this was somewhat of a new thing to do, it's becoming more and more common just since that time, since 2016. That doesn't mean it was uncommon though in other places in 2016. So I go to this church, I meet the pastor, who I call Bird, the very first time I go there. It was after the Sunday worship had stopped. About 300 people were filing out the doors of the activity center. I thought I was just gonna leave. I was just getting a sense of the place. I wasn't really sure, do I want to do an ethnography right now? I just started here, I got to publish for my dissertation. I don't know that I can carry out a new project. That takes a lot of time. He runs up to me, hey, who are you? Just immediately. He has a very magnetic personality. He's like someone immediately makes you feel seen. And he did really actually see me. He noticed me as a new person out of all these people. And I tell him what I do, and he asked me if I'm a believer. I said no. And then I told him I teach sociology of religion, and I teach sociology of religion. I had studied Christian punk before, and he's like, you should come study us. Like, all right, let me think about that. We need to talk about that more. So ends up, I get back in touch with Bird. I talk with him and his wife on separate occasions in the church office, and we talk about what does it mean for me to do an ethnography of the church. And now here we are, And I want to just point out that in my first conversation with him, he really emphasized them doing something different like Diane had, but he said something different than Diane had. He emphasized that they were a multiracial, inclusive church, that they really wanted to be unlike what those other churches in town were doing. And that he quoted MLK when we first met. He's kind of positioning them as a place where interracial families can come and worship, where that they are what he called a church of all nations. And so that piqued my interest, because right around that time, Donald Trump had been, named the presumptive Republican nominee, and this was a Southern Baptist church plant that was really branding itself as non-denominational. How is it going to navigate all that at once, right? So I spent most of my time joining what were called the church small groups. So I spent time with the racial reconciliation group that was started by a church member in the aftermath of Trump's election. First presidential election, and she's a white college student. She had participated in something called Be the Bridge on the University of Mississippi campus, and decided that she wanted to start something like that at Welcome, because it was promoting itself as being this interracial church, like a multiracial church. And then I also studied a kind of group that they didn't really have a name, so I called them Sunday Group. It was actually the biggest group of all. They met on Sunday nights. someone who was a well-established physician who, his house was really huge and a lot of people could meet there. And people of different class brackets were in that space, which is also really interesting. The church really also prided itself on being a place where blue-collar workers and more white-collar workers could join together. And I would say that that space really reflected that because of the various scales of income level for people that were in that small group. They really prided themselves on being a place where you can wear blue jeans on Sunday morning. And the pastor almost always wore blue jeans when he's preaching. I spent time with, my graduate research assistant, he spent time with what was called the Evangelical Apologetics group. I'm sure of those of you who have been involved in this group have heard about apologetics before in various ways, in various dimensions. So how do you defend secularism, or how do you defend your born-again convictions, right? That was what that group was organized around. Spent a lot of time with women and ladies, potlucks, and went to outreach events. I went to Sunday services, but that wasn't the core. I got a sense of what the messages were. I listened to some recordings once they had been streamed online, if I couldn't make it there physically, because I spent a lot of my ethnographic time, again, focusing on what people were talking about. And essentially what I found is that if people felt that they were touching on things that they defined as political, that they tried to evade it. Like, there was a lot of conversation management happening. And then you might ask, well, what's political? So I'm going to read a couple pieces from here, and then I think maybe you'll get a sense of what I mean. Does that sound good? Yeah. I think sometimes if you just hear it, then it's better. Okay. So this is just from the introduction of the book, where I introduced the concept of small talk. So small talk, you ever participate in that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, how could we not, right? Like, we gotta warm up to each other. So it's important, as an important social function. Small talk plays a profound role in bonding and belonging, yet surprisingly few sociologists take small talk seriously. This is in part because, as feminist sociolinguistics point out, small talk is associated with femininity and therefore shrugged off as inconsequential and unimportant. Before doing research at Wellcome, I dismissed the significance of small talk too. I thought it was pointless, space-filling talk that has no real bearing on what people think, what they do, much less on their faith or their politics. I assumed this book would solely be about what sociolinguistics term big talk, sociolinguist, I should say. Big talk, the influential talk that is linked to masculinity and understood as frank, factual talk that gets stuff done. And I might just add here, if I were to go back and edit, I would just assert that, again, that's where a lot of the attention to Christian nationalism is like the big talk, this talk. But there's a lot of complementary stuff that's happening that explains why that gets so loud. And that's the argument I'm making, is how does that big talk become amplified? Because of all the small talk, all the evasions that are happening, all the maneuvers to ignore the elephants in the room. Big talk transpires at social movement meetings, on Christian radio programs, from the pulpit, and on the debate stage. A focus on big talk falls in line with scholarly conventions, especially the research on Christian nationalism. A focus on small talk and what it accomplishes does not. So I go on to say that my perception of small talk and what it can do, the kind of political work it can do, changed while I was at Wellcome. I heard people in interviews refer to it as what they would call surface talk. Yeah, you just stick to the surface. At church, we don't want any tension. We don't want to bring up any conflicts. We don't want to get in a fight. Small talk permitted churchgoers to pretend as if they were all on the same page, especially when the stakes were high. And that small talk allowed it didn't allow, it actually limited what Paul Lichterman, sociologist, describes as reflective talk, or talk that encourages members of a group to ponder who they are and how who they are relates to other groups in their social world. So a short exchange at Recharge, a monthly potluck of food and fellowship for women, illustrates how small talk sorts out the potential for discussion and disagreement. It happened on a Monday night under the fluorescent lights of the church kitchen, which is up the stairs from Bird's office, Bird being the pastor. About 10 white women, counting me, ranging from millennials and Gen Xers to baby boomers, were there. The chatter around the table moved from recipes to annoying emails, from managing Facebook to the rising cost of electric bills, but never to Shane Claiborne, a Christian activist who was in Oxford the night before to speak on the death penalty, homelessness, and poverty. Eager to know what the women of Recharge thought about Claiborne's talk, I intervened and asked if anyone had attended the event, which a member of Welcome's worship team had helped organize. Marcia, a happy-go-lucky youth group minister, grinned. It was great. Curious if I could push the conversation further, I told the group that I had actually seen Claiborne before when George W. Bush was president, and that Claiborne at that time had taken a firm stance against the war in Iraq. Then I probed, what did he talk about last night? Marcia spoke up again. He met Mother Teresa. Mrs. Betsy, a senior and respected member of the group, leaned in forward. Wow, really? Marcia did not elaborate, and Mrs. Betsy did not ask her to. Instead, Marcia began running her hands down her thighs and saying that his pants were different, with lots of colorful patches on the front. All the guys were like, whoa, those pants are really cool. I want a pair like that. Go on. I won't continue to read, but the banter was about his pants and how cool they were, and that was all I learned about Shane Claiborne's talk. In the racial reconciliation group that I mentioned earlier, that was a 3-semester-long group. Trump was never mentioned the whole time. To me, that's like hard work. And there was times in which people would say, let's talk about what was in the news. And I thought they were going to make the comment about when he was saying that Haiti and others were shithole countries. That had like literally been in the news the day before we met for racial reconciliation group, and instead they talked about an H&M ad, an advertisement where there was some racially charged imagery. And I don't know, now looking back, if it was kind of a way to talk about the Trump thing without talking about it, because they know that there's members in the room that voted for Trump, but there's no discussion about that in a group that's about racial reconciliation. And I will have to say, though, that the racial reconciliation group was doing a lot more harder work than most group members, most church small groups were doing, so I don't want to pick on them. I think that there was a lot of like, how much can we talk? There were many white members of the group the very first time it met, and then within one semester, almost all the white members had left the group. So I understood that some people got upset because they heard the word white privilege one time, so that they couldn't take it anymore. They felt that the group had become too political. So just, again, what was political is really kind of defined around what could rouse disagreement, what could expose some tension, what could expose a potential progressive point of view or thought. Shane Claiborne's talk about the death penalty. Maybe if you just talk about what it was, it's like that becomes dangerous territory because you don't know where people might take that conversation. And so instead of engaging with it, it was like, how do we walk around it? How do we get out of it? And that's the kind of dynamics that I explicate in the book. But I also talk about the ways in the chapter called Back to Basics, where that, when it came to things like gender, it was very hard line. It was like, men need to take control of the house. Like, this is how it's got to be done. So there was also very explicit talk, and that was somehow seen as not political and not debatable. And so that was interesting. That's something that I'm trying to show in the book, is both how that small talk and the big talk are like co-constitutive, how that they're working together. One other little snippet I'll read, and then I'll leave it at that. On the night, this is at the very last chapter from a chapter called Take Down the Red Tape. And this is the chapter where I talk more about how the church sees itself as engaging with people who are outside the church, and where I'm bringing up more of the legislation, both in Mississippi and beyond, national legislation that fits under the umbrella of Christian nationalist legislation. On the night that Frank introduced his curricula on identity to the Sunday group, he went up to every participant one by one and asked them to take a slip of paper out of a handheld basket. Most of the participants did, but with visible reluctance. What is this? And I didn't do my homework, a couple giggled nervously. The slip of paper that I pulled from the basket read 11109. Was it a date, a code for scripture? I had no idea. At the close of his circuit, Frank announced that the slips of paper were meaningless, an experiment, nothing else. Frank asked for volunteers to explain their choice to take the paper. The responses shifted from "because you told me to" and "I trusted you" to peer pressure. Frank expounded on trust and ignored the remarks about authority and peer pressure. The group knows and trusts him, he declared. He turned to Anne and asked why she took the paper. Anne exclaimed, "She told me to take it," as she playfully nudged her friend that's seated beside her. The main of the idea of the experiment had been made, Frank said. Your friend in Christ encouraged you, and you listened to her. Christians can trust one another and should not trust anyone else, Frank concluded. For the second half of our lesson on identity, Frank handed out a piece of paper with a stick man and asked the group to list the kinds of people they're in relationships with. So imagine, I ask you all, take out a piece of paper and imagine the kinds of people that you're in relationships with. So we all start listing out things. A few members shout out their answers: spouses, children, employers, friends. When friends came up, Frank stood and asked if there are different kinds of friends. Hearing this, I wrote down close friends and acquaintances next to my stick man in my notebook. Another member stated confidently, believers and non-believers. Frank took out a dry erase board and set it up at the front of the room. He wrote identity at the top in bold front. Then he drew a stick man in the center of the board before adding the proper nouns, believers and non-believers, next to it. He smiled warmly and reiterated that Christians put Jesus on the throne of their relationships. And to put Jesus on the throne, they have to put Christians first. Volunteer for the church, spend time with their Bibles, be in community with other believers. Frank's lesson on identity reflected what Reasoned Defense had addressed, and Reasoned Defense is the evangelical apologetics group that I would say, I think it's a fair characterization, would be the space where that people did talk about very controversial stuff and took very hardline stances. And that group was smaller in number, but much more vocal in their opinions in the group. And my RA, who is a white man who also identifies as Christian, I think that they felt even more safe around him in some ways. So some of the things that were shared in those group settings were different than what I was seeing in the group settings that I observed. So that Reasoned Defense group had stressed something very similar to what Frank did in the Summary group. If a believer interacts with a non-Christian, that interaction should be directed toward planting the seed of God into their mind. If the interaction is not oriented toward that goal, it should never materialize. Believers should cut ties with non-Christians. Don't try to understand them or build bridges. Bridges are dangerous. Bridges lead to dialogue, disbelief, and disaffiliation. So just to point out that this idea that you have to kind of hunker down and isolate with other believers is also a way for people within that group to feel like I could be suspect as a non-believer too, which is also some of the reason people are reluctant to bring up their doubts and their questions about the church, or is it really achieving its multiracial campaign and mission? Because you might not be like you're on board with other believers. So in some ways, though, that kind of talk I think functioned really well to have this sense of uniformity. And what I'm arguing in the book is that there's really a performance of biblical sameness that's happening in these churches, where that we I would say I'm an outsider. From the outside, I just kind of assuming that all evangelicals are kind of on the same page, socially and politically, especially that are involved in something like the Southern Baptist Convention or Southern Baptist Church Plan. But in interviews, I found out that actually people have some doubts. They have some differing opinions, but they're worried about expressing those, and oftentimes didn't really have the practice and how to express it. But even in interview settings, they had a hard time explaining how that made them feel when they heard that men were supposed to take total dominion over women. Or they had a hard time talking with anybody else other than maybe their spouse at home about who they voted for. Otherwise, they just kept that to themselves. And even talking about that, like saying it, I found that people had a hard time even saying that. If they didn't have the rhetorical toolkit to pull on from the right to just say, like, this is why I think Trump's a great guy, or this is why I think that the Confederate flag should stay up, if they didn't have that, it was a little bit more messy. And I'll just leave it there. And I'm curious what you all have questions about or what's not clear, because I'm trying to kind of give a lot, and I took too much time talking, 30 minutes.
I can get started.
Yeah.
Where did you come up with the pseudonym Bird? 'Cause I have imagined like reason for it. Now let's see if it's real.
Well, Bird's a little bit of a little bit like a biblical name in some way. I would just say it fits with the person, and I'll just leave it at that. But you imagine someone who knows what's going on.
I was thinking it was because like with the whole like term of a church plant, and like he spoke a lot about leaving seeds of Christ in places. That a bird is something that eats the fruit of a tree and then plants those seeds elsewhere.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Great. I'm going to come back to you whenever I need pseudonyms. Like, hey, what do you think? And I can make it poetic. But yeah, I think, just to this point, that's one thing that I'm trying to show, right, is like those sociological studies are rooted in like one place and one specific time and moment. There's always this thing of like, well, what does that show about other places? And one thing I've found is that a lot of people, whether they're in evangelical church spaces or not, have experienced this in various ways. So I don't think it's unique. I think it gets exaggerated in these places. But the other thing about this is that church plants in particular are really kind of fascinating because they are churches that are what are called startup churches. It's like they have the support of another institution for usually about 5 years, and they've got some time to keep thriving or kaput, they're gone. And with that, there's a dynamic there of like, well, how do we keep going? And a lot of people are going in these churches showing up that they're new to town or they're new to the church too, right? The church is new, they're new. It's not an established thing. So I think there's also this dynamic that kind of lends itself to let's avoid the mine. Like there's a lot of landmines, let's avoid it. And so I bet that this is not unique to this church by any means. It's actually very, very common. Yeah. But I do like this idea of that's just the thing, is if the seeds keep dropping, that's what one person who I call Ryan in the book, that he said that's the point of the small groups, is to keep build, like the small groups themselves are like the micro churches. And imagine, he said, imagine if we have like one meeting Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, before you know it, every day of the week, even if it's just a small group, before you know it, everyone's going to be the same kind of Bible-believing Christian. Like that's the method. Yeah.
You mentioned it's not unique, and it's not, because my dad's church has almost those exact same dynamics, and it's a much smaller group, about 40-ish people or so. It's also about 50-50 multiracial. And my dad was the pastor who will occasionally confide in me about how difficult it is to wrangle people into not talking about certain things.
Yeah, I bet that. Has anyone studied that church?
No, I can find something.
There's quite a few scholars that they do a much better job of unpacking these dynamics. I'm thinking of Corey Little Edwards. I would definitely recommend her work, sociologist, who talks about this kind of what she calls the illusion of inclusivity, and that even sometimes whenever the church fits what social scientists will term like fits the category of what would be multiracial because of the numerical makeup, like what do white people give up in those spaces? And what she finds is that usually they don't have to give up too much. Like it's still about kind of safeguarding the comfort of whiteness.
I will say at my dad's church, the old white women have to give up talking about anything political or anything that interests them.
Okay.
He explicitly scolds them. Though I have heard the security guards talk about Michelle Obama's penis more times than I care to admit. It's very strange. It is very like you said, all those thoughts going around when you said earlier about like all these things being reinforced for the national stage. It just hit me. Oh my goodness, that's what all that small talk is. Because I wasn't even asking for it. He just brought it up for no damn reason. I guess he talks about it frequently.
I'll ask for you. Sorry, kids. Someone over there? No.
Who's over
Okay.
here behind you, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so not to harp more on the multi.
I should add, suppose, I don't think it's there, I just want to be sure.
Yeah, there was, not to harp more on like the multiracial aspect, but it triggers like a fight or flight response in me, and I was thinking why, And the main reason I think is Cliff Connectly and the way he talks about race. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's an online Christian influencer guy. He and his son were here actually and debated, and I think got destroyed by Bob. And he talks in such a weird way about race all the time. And I think you just kind of mentioned one point that I was mulling over, which is, I don't know if like black members of a church gain a lot by going to these, as much as maybe a white member would. But also, I don't know, it brings some kind of like ideas of like colonizing the thought of other ethnicities with white thought. I don't know. Maybe you have more in-depth ideas on that.
I would just say I'm going to stick with what the people that I interviewed said about their experience and their reasons for going. So, for instance, members that were involved in the Be the Bridge group. I'm thinking particularly about Amani, who she says that in the interview, she told me, she didn't mention, she just said election. She didn't really want to use the T word, but she said that she just had been feeling very harmed, and she was working in a public school district in Mississippi, and she said she was the only black teacher in the school, and that she oftentimes had parents really question her authority in terms of the instruction of their children. And you could just, like, she would come to the race, she would share this stuff, and she was the person who shared really deep cuts that she was experiencing and was very vulnerable, and I think took a lot more risk than anyone else in that church I saw take risk in trying to make connections, like authentic connections with people. And what she told me in the interview is that she found the church through a Google search. She saw that it was, or heard, I think through a Facebook post, that it was this church that wanted to be multiracial and inclusive. So she drug her husband there, as she says, and like, oh, Brian, he told me in his interview that he wasn't too sure about going there, but he decided, like, okay, I'll try it out. And then he was like, he found out about the black group, which was the Be the Bridge group, and he joined that. And he's like, I've been fine. The friends are, I made friends here. We're doing good. But she said she went there for racial healing. And she wanted to know, like, that people weren't, like, white people weren't as cruel as what she was experiencing in her everyday work life. And she felt she had found that there. And I think that in some ways attests to the low bar that's set in some ways. And also, it's not to take away like her feeling of connectedness and feeling of relationships that she was able to build in that church. Like, who am I to say? That's her experience. I also think that she was very disappointed when the Be the Bridge group stopped meeting. They had lost many members, and they had turned it into a parenting group, and she was disappointed by that. So I don't know that she's still at the church. I actually sent her a book in the mail. And I'm curious what she sees, what she finds, and I've told her, let me know if you want to talk. I don't mean that she represents everyone's experience, but her telling me that really stuck with me. So it's like the one that it just come to mind with your question. Yeah, you had a question over there?
Yeah, so there's kind of unfortunately like an impasse between like conservative religions and like social sciences. Did you ever have any difficulty like navigating your positionalities like sociologists like in these different like small groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I remember one night I was at the group that I call Recharge, and that's like a Monday meeting, usually about once a month. And one of the women who I call her Nancy in the book because she reminded me of Nancy Reagan. Like, she really like carried herself in that way, dressed, like just the whole thing. And just immediately I was like, that's the pseudonym that came the easiest for me out of everybody, Nancy. But I remember her asking, so who are you? And another person said, she said, what are you studying? And then the other one laughed, like, oh, and I looked younger than, like way younger. It's a long time ago. But thought I was a student, and the other one like, no, she's the one doing the church and doing the study on the church. She's like, oh, okay, well, where are you from? And, well, I moved here from Pittsburgh, and I could see the eyebrows, like, why are you here? and when I noticed that, I immediately, but my whole family is from Mississippi. Like I said, so able to draw on that. And she was like, oh, did you go to school here? No, but you know, I'm here now, and it's something about the being from Mississippi kind of toned down the questions that you could tell she looked more relaxed. I think that helped, right? I think that there was some conversation between members of people guessing whether or not I was like this really disgruntled atheist or something that was coming back to study the church or was trying to find God again. I definitely got that sense from like movie suggestions people would make. Other people, I think people just believed that I was part of the group, and you know, it was interesting. That's the other thing about the small talk that I mentioned in the introduction it was fascinating to me how much people didn't ask me questions. Because I think I was like, what am I going to say? How am I going to respond? And I would tell people why I was there. You know, I'm a sociologist, this is what I'm doing. But I didn't have a lot of questions about like, are you married? Do you have children? These kinds of questions that you would think would happen, especially in a women's potluck. I had to think, I may get the count wrong, but I'm going to say like 3 or 4 people the whole time. I had a couple people ask me if I was Christian or if I was a believer. Actually the word believer oftentimes, and I would just say no, and then just kind of keep it dry and short, and then they would move on. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you over here, Scotty. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to know if you thought that they had any training in avoiding conversations. It seems like almost every party or get together or group I get to, that within about 5 minutes, people are talking about politics or talking about Trump or talking about something else, and it seems that it would be a challenge not to do that, especially for newcomers into the groups. So I was wondering if you thought that they ever had any kind of training in some way or another of how to avoid talking about politics.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's some of the contrast that was happening is that I had joined the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in 2014. There was movement to take down the state flag on the campus. So all that's happening while I'm studying this church. And that's like the context that I keep showing of like, how do you study silence? Well, you study like the context of what's going on and say like, how do they manage to not address that? Because where I was working, that's what we were doing, talking. There was a critical race studies group and I don't mean to like toot our own horn. I'm saying our conversations were tense, and I also think there's a lot of avoidance and a lot of like, I don't know, you know, like what am I committing to by saying that? Does that make me an activist? Are we an activist department? Like all that was unfolding. So I think the contrast helped me see this more because of what I was experiencing in my workplace versus what I was like ethnographically observing. But is there training? I think training in the kind of symbolic interactionist form, like often has this book Forms of Talk, like we're reading how to know what's appropriate. Because the last thing we want to do is feel excluded. Like you might go to that group and not talk politics, and people might be like, what's wrong with that guy? Right? Like you might be incited that that's what you're supposed to do, even if you don't want to, because that's the norm of that situation. I would say that Amani and Brian, who I mentioned earlier in the Be the Bridge group, they were new, and I definitely felt that they were, I call what they were doing, speaking into the void. That a lot of times it'd be like, you say something, but then what happens is people kind of look at you, and then somebody brings up something totally different. So that's one way. And I think if you experience that enough times, you realize like, oh, that was a question that like no one wants to tangle with. Maybe you learn through those social interactions, you learn through that social engagement what is permissible within that setting. And I think those kinds of cues are happening alongside a lot of this message of making sure that you stick and do life together with other Christians. And both of those things are like operating to set the boundaries around what's appropriate. Yeah.
So I have a question about the term believer.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you all have seen in recent days, for example, some clashes between some members of the government who embrace evangelical views with the Catholic Church,
Yeah.
which is not something new because that has existed. You know, when we look at the relationship between evangelicals and Catholics in the 70s, when they were called associated with communism, and during the 80s also. But I was wondering if you had the chance to deconstruct this term in terms of how they conceptualize it. And if they were selective in terms of what does it mean to be a believer, it's not the same to be evangelical than Catholic, right? Were they kind of selective in terms of the relationships that they chose, for example, in terms of what beliefs they had, or perhaps they had to just believe in the Bible, or, I don't know. I just was wondering about that particular term.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because I'm just saying it as if you all would know, and that's something to define more clearly. So Bird, and I say this in the book, that he said at one point, told me that he was uncomfortable with the term evangelical, because evangelical kind of signals being a bigot or being racist in mainstream media. But there are other times that I did hear him and others refer to themselves as evangelical. There are many people in the church who said, claim they had never even heard the word before, evangelical. Some people would call themselves believers. I would say that those would be the more vocal ones, and Bird himself would say something like believers to describe himself. I say evangelical because in sociology, evangelical and political science, that's the term, and that's because they fit the criteria in many ways, and I outlined what those things are in the text. But to get to your question about what is a believer, one of the members, Darlene, who was the only person to bring up Donald Trump's name, in fact, that she has a gay son without my prompting in the church. She did not do small talk, and I was like really into Darlene. Darlene helped me see what was going on, just because she was not like that. And I was like, oh, wow. But she told me that she had to sign, they became official members of the church, and they had to sign a covenant saying that they were born again. And for her, that was the believer thing. And that she was even nervous, even though she's born again. She sees herself as born again. There was something about signing off on it. She was like, kind of, what is this commitment? Many people that I interviewed and studied never had become official members like that, or that they go through the training and they sign this covenant with the church. But what I gathered, this term believer was supposed to signify this idea that that the Bible is the Word of God, as they refer to it as the Word, and that it is inerrant, and that you're supposed to follow it line by line, even though, of course, it's selective literalism, what historians call selective literalism, because it's not everything's being followed. But also, I think a believer is also about this kind of identity, like the identity of I want to say evangelical Christian, that there is a default idea about what you're supposed to believe and what your attitudes and political opinions are, that even though they themselves aren't expressed, and you yourself may not be able to fully explain it yourself, is the identification as a believer that takes priority. It's kind of like, I'm with this group, and this is what we care about, and we believe that people should be praying in schools. We believe that the churches should be able to meet when school's not in session. We do think that the church should be able to intervene in sex education. That's a believer. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's beyond just believing in God, or a Christian.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
means also something about belonging to, or believing in a specific value.
yeah, so one of my RAs, she worked with me for one semester and studied the Sunday group when they first met. She started off studying that group she worked with me one semester, Heather Costa-Greger, and I talk about her in the book and her contribution to it. But she's Catholic, and they started calling her the Catholic from California. She was very much she was marked.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm from California. Us Californians that get marks here. So.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about public schools and everything. There's a chapter where I talk a lot about the discussion of public schools, and the atheists and the secular and the professors' kids go to that school, and there's kids even from Seattle. It's just the regional differences become something that makes someone suspect of not being able to be a believer, which is why I think, to the point about methods, why saying that I have family in Mississippi really helped me do the study. And of course, whiteness and being able to participate in small talk, because I know how to do it, because white people are really good at it. Really good at maneuvering around, like, yeah, let's not talk about that.
You mentioned, what was her name? Darlene, who had a gay son. Was he brought up frequently? Was he like brought up as like a point of pride or a source of embarrassment? And were there any openly gay members in the church that you could tell?
Yeah, I have a chapter called Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Gotcha.
Darlene told me this on the side at Recharge Night, one of the women's like monthly meetings. And she told me this kind of scooting away from the person who I called Nancy with a group that were bragging about what their sons do, ROTC, and my son's going to join the military. And then she told me that her son's single. She's like, he's joining something single. She's telling me this kind of like, quiet. And then I didn't know she was about to ask me if I wanted to go on a date with him. Like I couldn't tell where it was going. So I remember just being getting really uncomfortable. And she was like, oh, well, he's going to be just fine. And she's like, he's gay. No, I'm trying to find a church for him, but there's no church that'll take him. And he didn't live in Mississippi. He lived in another state. But I don't know how much she shared that with people. It certainly was not something that was talked about in an open way. I had to prompt people very deliberately about Mississippi's most extreme anti-LGBTQ religious liberty bill that's still law, the Protecting Freedom from Government Discrimination Act, Protecting Religious Freedom from Government Discrimination Act, which you're all familiar with that bill?
It's been a while.
Do you know what it says? You're nodding your head. Do you remember what it's about? Too much. It says too much. It's true. It's way too much. But I would ask people about that bill or about similar legislation. A lot of times people's reference was about the cake baker in Colorado. Some saying that they didn't even know that the law existed in Mississippi. I'm not sure if that's totally true. Again, I don't know if it's like a way of avoiding kind of what does it mean to be in a state that has this pretty really extreme law. But when people talked about, I would ask them, well, what do you think about gay people coming to church or becoming members of the church? Some people said that they didn't know what the church's stance was, which is interesting in this question about believer, because there's a default like idea, there's an assumed position, but probably the church isn't too down with it, but we really haven't had a conversation about that. And like one person who was much more conservative, he said that he wanted the church to take a hardline stance, and he was quote unquote tired of everybody playing the pretend game. There was a gay couple coming to church and had took communion, and the pastor told me that he kind of didn't even know what to do. He told me this on the side, like, I'm not sure what to do. I don't think that I can tell them that they can't, but I kind of want to tell them that they can't. But kind of like, hopefully no one says anything, and we just like let the thing keep going until, like again, like just try to put the dynamite in the closet and not, like, just don't talk about that stuff. So that's a long answer to your question about, but it just shows the dynamics of, especially around LGBTQ plus politics, it was really like silence. Silence is a form of erasure.
Forbidden topic.
Forbidden.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it would play into the way that they think about religious liberty legislation, because when I'm asking that, many people came down on the side of like whether they agreed with the cake baker in Colorado or not. Like, I don't think it's right, you should just bake the cake. Or I think you perfectly have the right to be your Christian conscience should come back first, and you tell someone, no, I'm not baking your cake. Regardless of where they stood on that, personally, many of them came to this idea in the interview that the best thing for people to do would just keep it to themselves. And don't, because if you bring it up that you're getting the cake for your gay wedding, that you are making the Christian person in a weird compromised position, and that the best compromise was just order the cake, but don't put the topper on it. So again, don't ask, don't tell. Which is a little bit what the religious liberty legislation is. I mean, it's what it's saying do.
And again, it sort of privileges the comfort of the in-group.
Right, it's like the feeling, that there's a lot of protection around being comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
When there was Obergefell v. Hodges, I think it was, when that happened, I do remember a lot of the churches in my area, and I know this hearing from the church I was at, a lot of the pastors, they would still do weddings, but what they wouldn't do was sign the documents that it ratified it. So that way it counted as a religious ceremony, and they didn't have to do any of like the government paperwork that they would be required to sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I can't wait to read your book. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds really interesting. I have so many questions, so I will talk to you about this more later. But I guess the question that's really on my mind is about what did they say to you in the private interviews? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I kind of got the sense, and maybe I'm wrong, but that they do, it's not the same uniform kind of position. So what were they saying in those private conversations? And what do you make of that in terms of like the large argument of your book?
Yeah, so I have a section that comes to mind with that question. I remember it, but I feel like I formed the whole book around chapter 3. It's called America is Divided, but the Church Cannot Be. And this is where I had to work through, like, what is the big picture here of what's going on? So, for instance, in a section called Keep Politics to Yourself, Thatcher, a family physician and lifelong Christian, echoed what other churchgoers said about keeping politics to themselves. After telling me that he always voted Republican but had decided to do a write-in when he cast his ballot for president in 2016, he shared that he is uncomfortable with being candid about his political views. Amy, did you talk with anyone about not voting for either of them? Thatcher, my wife and I did. But outside of that, Thatcher, I think it's come up a little bit with those that I know well. I feel like politics in church can sometimes cause problems. I feel like we are at a very white or black place in politics right now. Like it's almost not okay to be in the middle or in some gray area. I feel like you have to be completely pro everything or completely anti everything. Dave and Sharon, a married couple who claimed that racial hatred swelled during the Barack Obama presidency, helped me see what other interviewees alluded to. Sharon, when I asked her what she thought about the evangelical support for Trump, and then she told me, and then I said, did you vote for him? She said, some people might get plumb ugly with you for asking who they voted for. That's none of your business. And I remember being like, oh God. But then she kind of did it was actually a couple that I interviewed, and her husband Dave, he joked and he laughed, and then they kind of let me know that she wasn't going to beat me up or anything. That she wasn't actually angry, but she was also expressing her discomfort, her unease. And then they talked about, why they like Trump, that he doesn't sugarcoat things. He's rough about stuff, but at least you know where he stands. And that's about Trump. I had other things where that people are talking about, for instance, Brooklyn, the white college student who launched Be the Bridge group. She talked about how that after the night after Trump was elected, she texted the Be the Bridge group, the racial reconciliation group. And she said that, I'm trying to find if I can find the quote, but she shows me what she shared. Oh yeah, no matter how you voted today, there are people waking up who are really disappointed, really disheartened, and even scared. And so I hope that our group will be the light today. No one responded to Brooklyn's message. The group avoided the subject, even as one of its own members tried to bring attention to it. And that's because in the end, Brooklyn felt like others didn't, even if they were honest, they agreed with her, had some discomfort, they felt uncomfortable to express that out loud. And yeah, I think I could have easily gone into church and said, maybe 100% of the people or 95% of the people voted for Trump. And I bet that probably that's the case. And I'm not trying to put all the onus on the 5%, to say something, because that's a lot on them. But I do think that there's something really important for people, for all of us. I think the big lesson is, when we're in community with people and we're trying to build deep connections, we got to have hard conversations. We got to create space for disagreement. And there are people that are really invested in the church and spend a lot of time in small groups and going to Sunday services that clearly could not feel like they could ask, for instance, would this church bar my gay friend from coming? Like they didn't ask that question. They didn't feel like that they could. Oh, and I asked Arlene, would your son be welcomed at this church? She said, no. And I said, well, how do you know? I've never heard Bird even preach about homosexuality, or I haven't heard him even reference it from the church stage, but maybe I missed it. Maybe he has. Has he? Oh, no. It's just that they go by the word. And that thing that they go by the word, that they are believers, is the signal of like, we kind of all know what we're supposed to think, but there's people here that don't think that. And that really came clear in the conversation about gender. So in one interview, I had someone say she called herself almost feminist. And she said, I'm not on board with this idea that when I get married to a man, that he would have the authoritative voice. He would be the decision maker. And she said, for that reason, I've decided I'm just gonna stay single. And that was her way of dealing with that. Other members of the church that never called themselves almost feminist, but said, I didn't really like that whole sermon, and it made me want to walk out of the room. But they told me that in the interview. I got a real good sense when I said, did you talk to others about it, that they didn't. Like, there could have been like feminist consciousness raising groups going on in this place, you know? Like, I think that's what's really fascinating is that could happen.
It's so fascinating. One of our graduate students in sociology a couple years ago did an ethnography of a Southern Baptist white youth group and went on mission trips and did all this type of stuff. And one of the things that she found was that a lot of the girls were talking about, they had a lot of questions about abortion politics. They didn't necessarily agree with what their parents were telling them. They didn't exactly agree with what the church was saying about this. And there was I was thinking about that when you were just talking about these moments of kind of fracture and essentially with the youth, which is what I want to talk about later. But,
Yeah.
Did anybody speak to you that want to be off the record? Did you ever get to so deep down a certain trail that someone's like, okay, I want to get this off my chest, but I don't necessarily want this in the book, that kind of thing?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
But I wouldn't share what.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious how comfortable, because it seems that's one thing I kind of pride myself in this group, is that we're open to absolutely everybody. And we've had Christians attend, and I think that to a certain extent they found some relief in the sense that we've actually talked about stuff that they probably couldn't talk about in their groups, sort of thing. So I'm just wondering whether you found people kind of finding relief in getting a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, I do want to say that, for instance, one individual in particular that I just mentioned who, Darlene, who didn't stick to small talk, I thought I was going to interview her alone and her husband came with her. So I feel like there was also some moments where there were couples coming to the interview, and I also think there's some form of managing what people share in doing that. I will say at the same time, I don't want to say that people felt really open and felt very comfortable with me and just totally confided in me. I don't want to give that impression because I don't feel like that was the majority space. I will say though that my interview questions did ask about specifically about attitudes that we might deem as political subjects. And so a lot of people would say things like, it was kind of fun, or they would use words like it was uncomfortable, but I kind of liked having being able to talk about this because it's been on my mind but I haven't been able to talk about it. So that would happen a lot. People generally that have done interviews, people generally like to do interviews and hear themselves. So that's not any of you in here. I'm not picking on anybody from this book. That's just genuine humans. Mm-hmm. But so I don't think that was very rare. I think the comments of it felt a little charged and I kind of liked it in some way and I can't even really explain why. I was also telling. It's again, not having a lot of spaces to do that. I think in some ways I want to be hey, you all get together. you actually, you're not alone. Elizabeth Noel Newman, a political scientist, has this concept of the spiral of silence that I draw on. And the spiral of silence is that there's this majority opinion that gets louder and louder, and then people start to think everyone thinks like that, so I'm supposed to think like that too. And if you don't, then you feel that you're in the minority, so then you just be quiet and you keep it to yourself. And that maybe there's some possibility to break the silence together, but you got to feel that you're not the only one in the room. You got to feel like there's others here on board, because if not, then you are no longer a believer and maybe you don't feel welcomed in that space. And people are going to churches in Mississippi because they want a community and they want people to fall back on, and they don't have a lot of places. They're, not to pick on secularist groups, but it's true that atheist agnostics groups don't have usually aren't having some center for people to go to whenever somebody needs a car ride from the hospital, etc. Right? They have a real function in rural communities or in small towns. That's hard to just neglect that. Before, I'm sorry.
You mentioned that the build a bridge group, that it slowly became all non-white.
Well, not entirely, but lost many of its white members fairly quickly. And that might, in some ways it's because a lot of small groups start really big and then there's a dwindling away. But it became noticeable to the point where the group leader was like, hey, where did all the white people go? And I think felt like she needed to do something to not alienate the white members of the group, because what then would be the racial reconciliation? Where's the bridge? Yeah.
So did something, I assume something similar happened between like the self-sort of the sexes? Because it sounds like you're primarily with the all-women group. Even the couple you mentioned that the man found his own group of buddies.
Well, he actually came to be the bridge group. So he was referring to the black group with the racial reconciliation group. Yeah.
Was there any real mixing of the sexes, or was it pretty much even at the start, all the women went here, all the men went there?
So the Sunday group was mixed gender. The new family group that was studied was mixed gender, but there was a men's ministry night, and then and that only happened every few months, and the women's group happened about once a month. And then there was a book club that was only women. So yes, I have a lot more ethnographic research in terms of gender segregated spaces on women, but my grad research assistant, Pews, who's a sociologist, PhD student now at Notre Dame, he studied the men's groups and then the apologetics group, which was very masculine dominated group. But it's true that if you couldn't fit and didn't want to fit neatly into the categories of man, woman, there's kind of no space.
How much of the mixed group was coupled?
What is that?
How much of the mixed gender group was coupled? Like, what percentage of it was single?
So for instance, one of the Sunday group comes to mind immediately, that the 3 single women that came to that group, one of them was me, and then there were 2 single women, no single men I would see at these groups, which isn't so surprising. That maps onto what a lot of other studies would show.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you? Sorry.
No. You mentioned messy was the term that you used. Could you elaborate any more on that, about how they kind of responded?
Yeah. Let me tell you from a quote might be helpful. So this is a chapter called Back to Basics, which is specifically about the idea that you go back to the basics arrangement of gender. There's men, there's women, thus determined by sex at the time of birth, which God determines the sex, etc. As a queer feminist punk rocker, I've always, I'm taking it for what it is, but in this part, one of the members of the group she was really, let's say, connected to Bird in a very friendly way, and she was upset by the sermon that they did actually right around the time of Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court. It was in the Sunday after that, and that was their sermon about the gender order in marriage. And Bird and his wife Ann looked nervous on the stage. Like, you could tell that they were a little hesitant to kind of give the sermon, but at the same time it was like, they did it, and this is the order, and men are the umbrella of protective, like this protective authority. And Erin later tells me that she felt uncomfortable and that she wanted to walk out. And then she's telling me in the interview, that's what I say about messy. Well, I guess that's what the Bible says. But I think that the whole hardline thing, I feel like the church is just getting harder and harder on this. Like, I understand that, like, men and women have different roles and they complement each other, but like he can fix my dinner just as good as I can. Like he can bring me a plate. And then she's saying like, I don't know, I just feel like it's gone, kind of almost like it's gone too far. And the message has gotten more gruff and it's making me feel belittled. It makes me feel like I'm silly. And then later, she starts to talk through how that I think she thinks she's supposed to feel, because she's a believer. It's like, I'm supposed to believe that. She's like, so if the Bible says it, I believe it. But I don't know if the Bible says it. Maybe it says it, but I believe it says it. But then I don't know if I believe it. It was just this like, almost like a tennis ball, like going back and forth. And I felt like that's where like real like thoughts of self-actualization are happening. Like I thought it was a beautiful moment. Like the messy thing is actually, it's not to pick on people, but there's something about the word salad that was like, you're really trying to like process.
Find a position that you rely on.
Yeah,
You know,
you
one
can
step
rely
or the other.
on, and like where can you be? Like how can you be in that more skeptical position and at the same time be part of the church and like trying to figure that out? It's a hard thing to navigate. I think you had your hand up. Am I right? No? Okay.
I didn't have a question, so I didn't want to say
You did?
something. No, it wasn't a question.
Okay. You could just say a comment.
Oh.
Whatever.
Okay, so I thought like this is making me think a lot about my experiences, but I'm not American, but I used to live in Tennessee. And this, when you were talking about the church as a community and this idea of bringing people together, like being racially diverse, made me think of the church that my former flatmate used to go to. It was a Baptist church. I can't remember if it was Southern Baptist or First Baptist, so sort of either. I did go to this service a few times because she would invite me, and I'm weak, so I said, yes, I'll go, I really want to. But one thing that really struck me about the church, and also kind of why I didn't want to go, is that it's a big-ish church, so it's not like a small like church community. It's bigger, but they had like a building that the services happen in, and then they had a separate building that like Spanish services happen in. And then it's like a white church, a very white church, but two members of the church were actively like recruiting students from the school I used to go to in Tennessee, and which was mostly immigrant students from Africa. And they would go to the church for service, and the few times I went there, I noticed like it's not really something that I think maybe because I'm a sociologist and I look at everything like through lenses of like how are people like positioned, but like all the students that were immigrants and like colored would sit like kind of towards the back and like to the side, like always together in a group, like everybody else in the church would sit like separately. Mm-hmm. And then after service, they would have like a lunch with the students, like immigrant students, but like there were only ever like maybe 5 or 6 white people that would come to them at the service. And it was usually the people that were inviting them to come to the church. And I think I just found it fascinating because like from my perspective, talking to my friends, because a lot of the students, immigrant students were my friends, like I don't know how you do it because it's so obvious to me that the church is not really accepting, but they want to seem like they're accepting of like having like, you know, people of color being in the church, even though I don't actually see any Black Americans in the church, just us immigrants. And so they would have like these services, these lunches, separate from everybody else, a separate Spanish service church that I actually never got to go to. And in 2024, during the election period, it was so funny because that was when the whole like election situation was happening. And I would talk to my flatmate at the time about, you know, how is it going? And she'd be like, oh, you know, I know everybody's voting for Trump, but like, we don't really talk about it. And it's like, oh, that's interesting, like, are you cool with that? Like, I was curious, but not, I was trying not to come up as judgmental because I really wasn't judgmental. But
curious, like,
I'm curious how you're, I guess, reconciling this idea, knowing about, like, the ideals of Trump, like, and supporting those ideals. And one thing that came across is that, and some of them would say, oh, like, you know, I don't really, I believe in his policies when it comes to like maybe something with economics or whatever, but like they would never really talk about like the immigrant situation of like what Trump would say, probably because they're talking to the immigrants, so like it's harder to like say what you really think about that. So like this is what just made me think of that, and I was like, I don't really have a question, but like that's fascinating because I'm looking at it from the other side of it. So.
No, that's very helpful. I mean, I think you're like, it resonates a lot. I actually have a chapter called "We Don't Build Walls, We Build Longer Tables." I'm opening with the quote of Bird preaching, "We don't build walls, we build longer tables. Everybody is welcome here, no matter your race, your gender, your blah." And then God doesn't tell us to build walls, you know? And so that might make some of you hotter under your collar. And I thought, oh, was he like, this is the whole U.S.-Mexico border wall conversation. They put a lot of emphasis on reaching people, what they would call reaching people who are from the Hispanic community. You'd all say Hispanic community. And I'll say, I think if I say more, I might kind of give away who the church is, so I'm going to stop there. But just say that there's some similarities to what you're describing. But there was, in private, after, I kind of tried to make this politically neutral comment of like, does the wall message, does it have anything to do with the border wall conversation, immigration policy or control? And you kind of let me know that someone posted something on Facebook about build a wall, and he had a private conversation with that person about why that was problematic because they're trying to reach the Hispanic community. They're trying to get the Spanish speakers. He would sometimes use the Spanish word in services. And yet he's never going to address that from the stage in any way. Right? There's no real... I don't even know that he was completely in disagreement with the policy, but he did know that it would make people who are part of the church or part of an adjacent church upset or make them feel uncomfortable. So he would just have private conversations with people that were making this kind of Facebook post. Yeah, so very, very connected. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So
I guess you two know each other. I'm glad you worked that out. Oh no.
I'm not sure if there's a better term for this, but did you notice any more self-sorting of any kind? Because like it does feel like the potluck, like, oh, all of the Sunday night, let's all us women, let's get together, or the ministry of, oh, all the good old boys get together. Did you notice any other self-sorts, much like the Build a Bridge group?
Yeah, I would say that the apologetics group was started by someone named Bob, who was part of an apologetics group in California, moved to Mississippi, heard about this church, knew about the small groups program, introduced the idea, apparently was part of one on the university campus. I wasn't aware of that at the time, so I don't have any experience of what that looked like on the campus. But there were people in that group that I would say were more of the professional class, which is interesting because they had some really intense things to say sometimes. I won't name their occupations, but just say professional class, like with a little bit more resources than, let's say, Dave and Sharon that I mentioned earlier, who's like Trump because of his honesty.
Was it a majority male group?
Yeah, yeah. And then a couple of people were involved. One of them was a public school teacher. She eventually left after about 2 semesters to start because she wanted to join the women's group that was meeting on the same Monday night or something, a Bible study. She also took some pretty hardline stances about a lot of stuff. There was some dynamic, though, of the men in the group always talking and kind of getting in their own, not arguments, I would say, one-upmanship happening. And so kind of that sorting, I would say, was pretty distinct. People who felt that they were trained in argumentation were in that group. And then there was the Sunday group. What I would notice is that Dave and Sharon and a couple other people who were much more, like presented as much more working class, would identify as working class, they sometimes were sitting by themselves. You know, they weren't necessarily in the kind of the center popular group. And a lot of times they would be talking to me or talking to the group leader. So I always felt like I was also the one like hanging out with the people that are on the periphery. Like I ended up talking to Darlene. So it might be also where I find my comfort zone ends up being the periphery of the church, but it's also the people that I interviewed were people that were not just going to Sunday services, but they were involved in the Sunday, in a small group in one of the small groups. So I'm very much stuck to the idea of I'm trying to get a sense of people who are investing more time than just a Sunday morning worship service and going, even if they might look like they're on the periphery.
Yeah.
But that's the idea of the church, is that they welcome everybody, so they didn't feel on the, I think they also felt like they were part of something that was doing something different. Yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of the participants were in some of these smaller groups, not just going to the Sunday service. Could you talk a little bit about how you were able to recruit these participants in your study, and how many participants, what the methods type of questions?
Yeah. So most of the small groups that I would study, it would be like they meet most but not all met once a week. And so I went to the Sunday group, and I oftentimes went to one that met on Monday night. And then Pace's group, I think, met on Tuesday night. So I would get his field notes from that apologetics group. And I really stuck to, I go to groups that I can write good field notes the next day, because I'm focusing on interactions. So I'm like jotting down field notes, but I'm also dumping everything from beginning to end when I leave the setting. So like here, let's say I leave, I'm getting out my phone with the voice recorder, and I'm trying to recount, going by my field notes that are jotting, like what happened from beginning to end. That's how I recorded it, not by theme, which I think is why I could kind of track what conversations were like really popular and which ones fizzled out really quickly, because I was tracking those kinds of dynamics. I didn't know that's what I was doing at first. I was a couple months in before I realized, like, I need to start paying attention to this closer. So it's one of those things that you don't know. Like, I didn't know I was going to write about small talk, or like define small talk as a process of omission. I didn't have any idea. But the interviews is smaller. Like I have about 42 or 40, between 42 and 40. I can't remember. I should be able to know the number, but some are like informal conversations that I don't count as part of the interview study. I only count the ones that I like sat down and recorded it and went through more or less the same semi-structured interview guide. But it was asking them face to face when they were there. And Pace, who studied the apologetics group, interviewed 2 people from that group, which was a group of 7.
And so did you wait till after you kind of immersed yourself in observation before approaching your participants about participating in interviews, so that like you were a familiar face, so you weren't just like this person who, so like getting an entree or an entry into the field first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's for that reason I started to realize that I should ask, have you ever talked about this with others before? Because I would not have known to ask that if I would have just started with the interview study. Because that confirmed what I thought that I was seeing. It was just nice to be able to hear back from the interview participants of like Thatcher, well, me and my wife have talked about it, but outside of that, no. So that was the way. Yeah, so definitely building rapport by being there, asking people after a small group meeting, hey, would you mind being interviewed? And you just let me know. We usually did it at a Panera Bread, like a very kind of nondescript place that felt comfortable, especially for the church members to meet.
How long do you feel like it took you to build rapport? I'm asking these questions for the students in the room. How long do you feel like it took you to build rapport before you could start interviews?
I think I want to say that I don't know that I could get this exactly right, but around maybe after 3 or 4 meetings would probably be my very first interview. Was about that many meetings. I think my very first interview was with Brooklyn, who started to be the bridge group, because she was soon going to be moving, and I knew I needed to get it in before she moved. And then another member of the church took over to be the bridge group, and I also interviewed her. And she had already seen me in Brooklyn to be the bridge group, so that was easy. She wanted to do the interview. Brooklyn was probably, I think I'd been to about 3 meetings at that point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in general people see your face and they see that you're not just there as a journalist one time, that they're gonna say, yeah, why not? And let people know what it's about. Always kind of, this is the kind of questions I'm going to ask you. You can't get it wrong. I will ask about like the church's mission to be multiracial, inclusive. I'm going to ask I'm gonna ask about gender, are women and men, like what makes a man godly, what makes a woman godly in the interview setting. I didn't bring up the election though. I didn't tell him up front I was gonna do that. I waited till, I had to like wait to the right moment in the interview to like bring it up. It was really dicey. It felt like the thing that you weren't supposed to ask about. So I had to be strategic about when I brought it up. You, before, because you did the, you run scissors.
I don't know if you got this from the pastor. What was the turnover rate? And do you know if the pastors adjusted strategies after this book? Because the reason I mention this is my dad is a pastor, and one of his friends is specifically employed as a church seed planter. They are employed by these larger mega churches to manage the back end of the planted churches. And I do wonder how much of the pastor's emphasis on avoiding stuff was specifically, how much of that was influenced by the turnover rate, how long they had for the support for the parent church, and things like that. So did you get any back end data, or was it purely on like the numbers?
I don't have any. Like I have some data. I have an interview with someone that was actually, I think, one of the only people who wasn't involved in a small group or a leadership capacity like Bird. He was part of the group that planted the church, but was still part of the old church.
Gotcha.
Right? And you could tell he was definitely suspicious of the sociologist interview.
Oh.
Because he kept putting it off more so than anybody else. And again, I didn't meet him in person ever. In fact, I wanted to meet him in person, but we ended up doing the interview over the phone after he had canceled on me a couple times. And so he was definitely the most suspicious. I don't always say suspicious. That's not. But yeah, more skeptical of like, what are you here? You know, what are you doing? And he never met me before.
Well, you're doing
but he
his
had been
job.
recommended to talk to me by others, which I think is why he finally agreed. I don't know about the turnover. I would just say that this church was started in around 2014, so it was fairly new when I started there. It was only not even 2 years old yet, so it's still running. And there's an established group in the community. I will say that, yeah. So I don't see it going away. I mean, that's not the plan, is to try to make it go away. There's many church plants, and there's been more church plants. There's actually a church now that meets where they used to meet at the recreation center, a new one. So again, these things are, I don't know what it's like in Starkville, but they're proliferating.
Pine Lake would be a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about the same, the fact that, Oxford is, has a significant amount of people who, are from different origins, racial and ethnic backgrounds, and it's quite diverse, right? I was wondering whether the church perhaps was using that as some strategy, the emphasis on inclusivity and the welcoming message, as a way to survive. And I was wondering if that was used only there because of the demographic characteristics of Oxford, and if it varied comparing what they were doing in the same congregation in other places perhaps where there is majority of white residents, for example, perhaps more rural areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is both that the university town's composition was changing. At the time, there was this idea of what I write about, this growing blue bubble that was happening, meaning like the professors coming in from different parts of the country, they're getting jobs there, like changing things, and then their students that are coming from different parts of the country. There's all this idea of like outsiders, but there's also like the group that was the most mobilized to get the flag off the campus was the NAACP group, and that was student-led, and that were black students from Mississippi. So the idea that it's always outsiders was, I think, is a false narrative, but at the same time, there is something to be said about the fact that there are more and more out-of-state and out-of-country people coming to the town. It's still very much a primarily white institution, just as the church is. But definitely drawing on this diversity before that was banned, right? So now we're in the post, we're at the place where that, actually I think the dynamics I'm finding here are don't talk about it, don't use words, use ambiguous language, becomes law. That now is the law. That's now like kind of the law. But at that time, it wasn't yet, and it was more of the idea of like, you need to present as inclusive. Diversity and inclusion is the language, and it's the language of the university, it's the language of what we're supposed to be doing. And so absolutely you draw students in, or you know, because there was a lot of emphasis on it being a multi-generational church that appeals to young people. Whether or not they succeeded at that part, maybe not so much. I think other churches, I heard somebody say Pine Lake, that they have a big student presence. Maybe Welcome Church not as much, but they wanted to be a youth, attract young people. Yeah.
Okay, so I just have to ask a question about youth that I wanted to ask you separately, but. So what is going on with these parents? So to mention that group turned into a parenting group, you talked about how bridges can be perceived as scary, that they want to isolate with other believers. So how does that, my question is so selfish because it relates to my own research, but like how, when I'm studying people, maybe some of you, who disagree with their parents about politics and race-related matters, if you'd like to be interviewed, you can contact me afterwards. But I'm super interested in this idea of like how parents try to protect their children from like all these outside forces like you're kind of mentioning, and specifically in these religious contexts. So what I'm finding in my data is like some students go along with that, or kids go along with that, and other kids are like totally reject that, and they don't like that. So I was curious if you have any data even just how the parents were talking about their objectives in parenting children, and like religious socialization and racial socialization, and like how all that kind of comes together.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're going to talk more
I
because
didn't want to ask it, but I had to.
because I think where I left on this in the last substantive chapter of the book, Take Down the Red Tape, is really a lot about schools and parents. It almost like that's the filler for all the other stuff that people don't talk about. There was a lot of like the public school and the county school versus the city school, and how the city school you can't be Christian there, but you can be in the county school. And there's quite a few homeschool moms that were part of these groups that at one point were teachers before in the public school system. So there's a lot of kind of this, you know, how do you be strategically ignorant about others' experiences? There was a sense of we need to implement our values and our beliefs in the public school system, and now you just can't even be Christian anymore. There was a lot of that narrative, which makes me why I've become more and more interested in education. Like, how does this micro school movement a manifestation of strategic ignorance? So Michael Klintman, an environmental sociologist, he has this concept of strategic ignorance, and there's been critical race scholars who talk about white ignorance, definitely drawing on that research and this idea of the conspiracy of silence or strategic ignorance. Like, how do you maintain your kind of your groupness, your values, your beliefs, is by, you know, shutting off from information that conflicts with that. What Alfred Schutz, the phenomenologist, calls the zone of relevance. This is your relevant zone. And I think that's interesting to think about how the kids who are getting this one message and kind of, this is your lane, stay in your lane. How are they like staying in the lane, or how are they like, I am out? I am out of this lane. Yeah, that's really, really interesting to think about. Yeah, so I don't have data on the parenting group. I almost feel like it's the follow-up, is like, where is religion and education coming through? And I'm working with the RA right now. We're just trying to map out through a Facebook, not that we're going to do a study of Facebook, but just what is the discussion over the Mississippi legislation for school voucher look like? Like, when does that emerge? What are the conversations online looking like? And we're trying to find potential homeschool, micro school, or these alternative school settings as potential sites. We're really at the very exploratory stage, but
or even like the
curious about it.
segregation society.
Yeah.
One thing I want to insert is on the, I'm losing my train of thought, and I'm not quite sure how to say it, so I'm just going to say it's a little blunt. One point of interest, at least for me, and I'm wondering if it is for y'all as a jumping off point, is in those gender divided points where it's about like the roles of men and women and in education with children, would you see a trend of it, like it is not the woman's role to hit the kid, it's the man's role to hit the kid? Because when I was growing up, that was kind of a point culturally. It was the man's job to hit the kid whenever the kid messed up and did something bad or sinful. The woman couldn't do it, she could only report it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no one talked to me about that in front of me, so I don't have anything about that. But of course, that dynamic that you're describing assumes that you do have a heterosexual marriage and relationship. You know, it's a way of also teaching that that way that families have to be formed, because there's a division within the family of who does what. You all, this is the longest conversation. And you all are still here. You know, well, MSU. I want to tell you all something just really quick. I was teaching sociology religion today, right, because that's what I did right before I came here. And we're reading a book called Keeping It Halal, The Ordinary Lives of Muslim American Teenage Boys, like ordinariness, something we talk about. But I told them, you know, after this, I'm going to go to the free thinkers, agnostics, and atheist groups at Mississippi State University. I don't know what to expect. And they go, oh, I hope you're going to be okay. I said, wait, what? I'm not scared of agnostics or atheists. And then I said, are free thinkers? And then they were like, oh. And then there was a couple students said, well, it's just, you know, Mississippi State. I don't know. Are they going to get the cowbell after you? I don't know. So it was the best group ever. Thank you
Well,
all.
yeah, big thanks to Dr. McDowell for coming and presenting.
I mean, really, you're here at